Recently, we passed a grim milestone, which was 10 years of war in Syria. Now, obviously, that has been an absolutely devastating conflict. About 500,000 dead, millions displaced, a country in absolute ruins. It's a completely nightmarish situation. Um, and I didn't make a video at the time because I'm not sure what angle to take with it. I've made a few videos around the Syria war. It's something I've been in debates about. I've met a few Syrians, refugees, and heard their experience. But it's a very grim situation, and it shows how devastating a civil war can be. I do think civil war is a fairly accurate term, although there's obviously other components as well. Um, at the peak of the violence, it was described as a mini world war going on in Syria, which is probably what it felt like. Um, but I've just read about a professor at Edinburgh University, and I think he, in my opinion, exemplifies a certain kind of Westerner who takes a position that is sort of outside the box. I say professor, but this can maybe extend to a few other areas. So-called freelance journalists who say that they're freelance, but they really end up serving as propagandists for one side or another. But this is a good example. Now, I'll show you the report in the Times. I'm not going to read out the whole report from this because it is quite in-depth and comprehensive. But check it out. By the way, I should say this is from the 26th of March. Professor gave names to fake Russia spy. So it's about this guy, Professor Paul McKeag of Edinburgh University. I'll go read out the BBC article. I have a big problem with people like this, and I'm going to lay out my reasons why. I'll just say this: something like Syria, um, is always going to be a very, very potentially heated issue because we're talking about war, we're talking about death, we're talking about human suffering on a massive scale. So something like that is always going to be very emotionally charged. But I'm going to read out the BBC report then, just share a few of my thoughts because he's not the first person to come out with this sort of position. Anyway, here's the report. A British academic corresponded for months with a man who hinted he was a Russian agent seeking help to discredit a group that gathers evidence of Syrian war crimes. Professor Paul McKeag asked Ivan, that's the pseudonym, to help find evidence that the group's director worked for the CIA. In fact, Ivan's emails were written by staff at the very group Professor McKeag was targeting. The professor said he hadn't done anything wrong. He also said he had kept an open mind about whom he was communicating with. I highly doubt that. I think this guy has an agenda. But anyway, Professor McKeag had been trying to unearth details about the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, CIJA, an organization that gathers Syrian government documents for war crimes trials, when he struck up the email exchange. CIJA documents are currently being used in a war crimes trial in which a former Syrian military intelligence officer stands accused on 4,000 counts of torture. The Edinburgh University professor wanted information about a woman CIJA's director might have slept with and asked whether he was a cocaine user. He also asked for information about a list of British academics and journalists, including two who work for the BBC, and suggested to Ivan that your office keeps an eye on a journalist working for a Russian media organisation. Professor McKeag is a member of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, a collection of British academics and independent researchers who say the UK government is running a propaganda campaign against Syria designed to prepare the ground for regime change. Sounds to me like they are Assad stooges. He sent Ivan a draft of a critical report in to CIJA he had co-authored with two other members of the working group, Professor David Miller of Bristol University and Piers Robinson, a former professor at the University of Sheffield. CIJA Director Bill Wiley said staff who wrote the emails to Professor McKeag did not say they were a Russian agent, but tempted the professor to make this assumption. He says they carried out the deception because they were concerned that the working group's report might reveal sensitive information about the location of its archive of more than 1 million Syrian documents and the identity of its staff. Suja keeps the location of both confidential for security reasons. BBC journalist Professor McKeag asked Ivan to investigate, our Syria producer, and Chloe Haj Mafu, reporter and presenter for the BBC Radio 4 intrigue series Mayday. It was during an investigation for Mayday that the BBC was able to read the email exchange. Professor McKeag, an epidemiologist, told the BBC that, like any other citizen investigator, he cultivates contacts with all kinds of people who may have relevant information, including anonymous sources. He said it was entirely legal for him to do this as a private citizen without access to state secrets. The other members of the working group knew nothing about his email exchange with Ivan, he said. Professor Miller did not respond to the BBC's request for comment. Piers Robinson said the working group was entirely independent of any state organisation. Right, there's a lot to take from this. It's a complex case, but this very much reads to me, this working group strikes me as being very ideologically pro-Russia, pro-Assad. So they're framing themselves as sort of independent observers. Um, to me, something like this has echoes of the journalist, so-called freelance journalist Eva Bartlett. Now, some people might know this name. She was a Canadian citizen who went to Syria, and she came out with all sorts of propaganda videos which were featured on Russia Today, pertaining to show the lies of the West and basically demonizing the white helmets as terrorists. Some of the more extreme claims of Assad supporters is that the white helmets would go so far as to commit massacres themselves in order to frame the Assad government, and then they look like the rescuers. There's no question that the Syria war is a very complex and very messy conflict, and there have been atrocities on both sides. Well, not that there are both sides, there are lots of sides. But what I find absolutely sickening to the core is the idea that Bashar Assad has somehow been misunderstood, or hasn't been guilty of crimes against humanity. Because if you look at the Syria regime, there were serious human rights abuses being levelled against it long before this war began. So the narrative that has been put out by Russian state media is very much, this is a leader who has bravely defended his country from terrorists. Well, there are terrorists on the ground. There are sadistic death cults like ISIS. We know what they're capable of. And the optics of that is obvious. If you get these ISIS fanatics, for example, throwing gay men off buildings or drowning people, obviously, if Assad is their enemy, well, he must be the good guy. The sad reality is it's not that simple. The sad reality is there are a few good guys in this conflict. Assad, as far as I'm concerned, is a monster. This is a man whose regime has presided over severe torture, the barrel bombing of children, extensive war crimes. I mean, I just cannot fathom how anyone could serve as an apologist for a tyrant like that. I remember watching a documentary on the Arabian Spring, would have been about 2012. I think it was We Are Giant, it was called, and it was kind of a collective documentary that was looking at Egypt and other countries as well. Now, when Assad appeared in an interview, I think it was with the BBC actually, this was early in the war, pretty much every Syrian in the audience heckled and jeered because they hate this man and they hate what the sort of excesses that he's done. Now, these people were not hardcore Islamists. They were not. They were just ordinary Syrians. Um, I think there has been a very effective propaganda campaign. The so-called working group, they accuse the West of propaganda. I mean, the sort of things that they have come out with, I don't mean just them, but Assad's apologists, backed by the power of the Russian state, it's staggering. It's a very large scale level of manipulation. So Eva Bartlett, for example, claimed that she was an independent journalist. Well, what sort of independent journalist actively serves as a cheerleader for one side over the other? Eva Bartlett is on record as supporting Bashar Assad and believing that his government policies were correct. Now, that is not the behaviour of a freelance journalist who claims that they're just trying to find the truth. And the other obvious question is what would make someone like her, who's been on the ground, granted, well, how come she knows more than a lot of other journalists who've been on the ground? I think there's a lot of confirmation bias in this. People like Professor McTeague and Eva Bartlett are ideologically, in my opinion, anti-West. So they want to find any narrative that will suit the idea that this is all just Western warmongering, and even though Assad started this war, um, and oh, poor Assad is just being framed by the West. He's never hurt a fly, he's a nice guy. He's just an embattled leader. It's disgusting actually, because independent human rights groups have documented his crimes. Um, I mean, the thing about something like this is, like I say, it really galvanizes strong emotions, because we're talking about war and death and depressing subjects like severe human rights abuses. But I think one of the biggest, maybe the biggest manipulation that the world has seen over the last decade is the, for want of a better term, the placating of Bashar Assad by the Russian state. Um, it's certainly one of them. It just, I just find it sickening. Even if you're of the view that Assad is the lesser of two evils, you would still have to concede this is a man who's committed absolutely horrendous acts. Um, the working group, from what I've seen, have very little actual evidence to, prove that, for example, the white helmets are terrorists. I remember Eva Bartlett was sharing information that pertained to show a girl in a little red dress, and supposedly this proved that the photos of chemical attacks and barrel bombings was fake, because apparently the same little girl could be seen in two photos. Now, that was fact checked, and what actually transpired was there was a little girl with a red dress in both pictures, and she did look similar. But closer analysis, photography experts and so on looked at this, and she was a different girl. She looked similar, but she was a different girl. And it kind of reminded me of, in the States, you have these people claiming that mass shootings are really crisis actors, because for them to admit that they're the guy they support, Bashar Assad, may actually be guilty of horrendous things, they can't do it. It wouldn't fit their narrative. So instead, they switch the focus to, oh, it's all Western propaganda. Um, Personally, I think a guy like this is a complete lowlife. To be enjoying the comforts of a Western city, Edinburgh, um, and to be using that to serve as basically a stooge for authoritarian regimes. It's very clear this guy has no problem at all working with Russian sources that are anti-West or pretending to be. Um, Legally, he might not technically have done anything wrong, but that's a grey area. The Times report states. Toby Cadman, a London barrister specialising in international justice, said that McKeague had engaged with what he believed to be an agent of the Russian state for the purpose of undermining individuals and groups documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. He added, this is a matter that the UK law enforcement and prosecuting authorities will now need to look at. Edinburgh University has defended him under free speech. As far as I'm concerned, this guy is just a lapdog for Assad. And he really, I think that what the working group is doing is potentially putting people in danger by smearing people involved in human rights groups as liars. It's and potentially revealing their locations and so on. If they have the capability to do that, it's like I say, it's a complex case, but I've seen this sort of mindset before. I've seen this sort of ideology. I mentioned Eva Bartlett, but there's others. Um, and I think, personally, I think it's reprehensible. I think particularly Westerners who, if he was a Syrian and he was an Assad loyalist, well, it's a war. That would be, it would still be reprehensible, but it's the nature of war. But for a British academic to knowingly, um, basically work with the Russian government and the Assad regime, or rather work in their favor. I mean, he may not be technically working with the Kremlin, but he is fueling that narrative that the Kremlin puts out, and it sickens me, to be quite honest. I think his behaviour is treacherous. The same guy, incidentally, has also questioned Russian involvement in Salisbury, which is an insult to the victims of Salisbury. It's an insult to everyone who's involved in that. I really take a very, very low opinion of Westerners who go out of their way to defend the likes of Putin and Assad. In fact, it sickens me to the core. Um, and I think there's something pathologically wrong with people like that. They say they're just trying to get to the truth, but the truth could be staring them in the face and they would still come up with a conspiracy. Um, it depresses me, it angers me, and if this guy has put people in danger by naming them, um, by going about this the way he has, then he should face legal consequences. Difficult to charge a private individual with treason. You know, he's not a member of the armed forces. He's not a member of MI6 or anything like that. But it does show a particularly regressive attitude among some academics that they are willing to basically serve as apologists for brutal dictatorships. It's something I cannot fathom.